Hey folks, this is the Counter-Racist Evolving Engineer Program. The acronym for the program is Cree, C-R-E-E, and that is my handle for the Time Vault. The date is August 9th, 2019. It is approximately 4:15 p.m. here on the west coast of the United States where I am, and that means it's about 7 p.m. on the east coast of the United States. Here to talk about Marianne Williamson's plan for reparations. It's concerning because it's consistent with all the concerns I've had thus far. She has been unveiling her plan for reparations slowly ever since the second round of debates on July 30th, and a little bit at a time, a little more when she's been doing her media rounds on CNN and so forth. And then now she has her plan, the outline of her plan written on her website. And it's concerning for all the reasons that I have been concerned thus far, but now we have an actual plan. And, it was savvy of her, although it may seem sincere, maybe it is sincere, to leap out ahead of the field and say, well, not only am I for studying, for establishing the commission that H.R. 40 calls for, that was introduced by Congressman John Conyers in 1980. So they're all signed on to that. She says, nah. Let's stop all the games. Let's not just study it. We all know we need to pay. So she's jumped out ahead of the field and said, let's go ahead and pay it out. And then she has a plan for how to pay it out. Well, that plan, like I said, is very problematic. Let's start with why I have this graphic up here, because it's the nexus of what the problem is. The nexus is, how do you qualify as one of the people who get your reparations? I mean, there are problems with the amount, huge problems with the amount. There are problems about how it's going to be spent. Huge problems about how it's going to be spent, according to her plan. All of this according to her plan. But the biggest problem is going to be how one qualifies for whatever payments get dispersed. That's the biggest problem. No matter how small they are, no matter what they are earmarked for, which are problems, the bigger problem is, how do you qualify as someone who gets the payment? And so that's why I have this graphic. Normally this does not say ADOS error. It says 404 error, page not found. And then there's a picture of a page torn out. And that's the page torn out of history. That represents the page torn out of the documents that would prove that we had one or more ancestors that was enslaved. For some pretty diabolical reasons, there's somebody, I believe, out there, I think it's a whole army of people who are dedicated to convincing the public, but particularly true ADOS people, that it's going to be easy to document one ancestor. And it seems like that's such a reasonable thing to do, just one ancestor. Because when I try to discuss this on social media, I get these ridiculous responses back that belie what we know the truth to be, that totally contradict the truth, that it's going to be easy to do. All you have to do is do your genealogical research. And it's, even though it's consistent, I hate to have to bring him up again, but it's consistent with what Dr. Darity said. It's not going to work. And it makes no sense for anybody to say that it is going to work unless there are people who are racist, meaning people who practice the system of racism, anti-Blackness, who are encouraging these true ADOS people, these true ADOS people to believe such things. Even up to the esteemed economics professor, Dr. Sandy Darity, to believe that it's going to be easy to document one ancestor if you're truly ADOS. When in fact, one of the hallmarks of being an ADOS person is you can't document it. And as I move through this short video, I'll show what should be obvious. But you hear something over and over and over and over again, you tend to believe it. Oh yeah, you can do it. Yeah, you can do it. Oh, who are you? You're just lazy. No. And we shouldn't even be required to do this in the first place. One is, it's just not going to be easy to lay our hands on it. It's probably going to be easier. In fact, it's going to be impossible for most of us. And I would say statistically, it's going to be easier for a person who has not been black and whose family has not been black for, say, 4 or 5 generations to find it than people who are still black and descendants of slavery today. The reason for that is just because non-black people just have more access. They have more social capital. So they have more access to people who know about things that are not publicly known. ADOS people, black people in this country, are pretty much restricted to things that are well known, even if it's in private universities. We generally don't know what's in private collections, even if it's in private universities. Some of our history is located in vaults and museums outside of this country. And so you just have to know people who know these things, who tell you, and they can give you a line of breadcrumbs to find a document. But it's very similar to the way that we get jobs. We are pretty much restricted to looking for jobs as publicly posted, as publicly advertised online or elsewhere. Whereas non-black people, that's not how it works. They normally get their jobs through social networks, through social capital. You know somebody who knows somebody who knows somebody who has a job that matches your skill set or is willing to give you a shot. But that's not the case for us. And, that is going to be a problem from the second generation of disbursement forward. It's going to be a problem the first generation too, but it's going to be a greater problem the second generation. That 20-year period that you're going to see Marianne Williamson talking about, but even a 10-year period is going to be a problem because that's going to give them a head start. So they're not ADOS. They haven't been for many generations, but now that they know all they have to do is start claiming it for 10 years, well, they can get started now, because even if Marianne Williamson is elected, or somebody is elected and takes up her plan or one that's like it, it's going to take some time to wind its way through Congress, to be debated upon, negotiated, voted in, signed. That's like 2-3 years. And then you have, if it's going to be dispersed over a period of time, shortest period of time I heard Marianne Williamson talk about initially, and that's the one, no. The shortest period of time is on her website right now, 10 years. But initially she was talking about 20 years. But either way, that's enough time, because you get a 3-year head start minimum, and possibly like a 13-year head start. Because if you disperse it over 20 years, you've got like 13 years, the 3 years of it winding through Congress, and then 10 years to do more research before you have to start claiming it, because that's what's on the table right now. So her policy is not inconsistent with what the most prominent people that she would probably include on her council of elders. That's what's in her plan, to decide how the money is spent and who gets it. So and these elders are signing on to, well, you just identify as being black for 10 years. And so you can see that this gives non-black people a chance to go ahead and do that. So they've got all that time to find that ancestor and all that time to identify as black and then have their hand out. Okay? Which is going to be a problem in the first generation, but after the first generation, it's going to be even more of a problem. And it's just convincing us that we can find this documentation when it's not true it's very, very diabolical. And it is the type of thing that a racist person would do. Now, I'm not saying Marianne Williamson is racist. I don't know who's in her ear. Maybe she is sincere, but she's just got this wrong. It would not be politic for me to say that she is a racist. However, I have to tell the truth. I'm suspicious. So let's go on to her plan. This is how she first unveiled it when she was making her media rounds after the debates. It was 200 to 500 billion over 20 years. So you see where that 20-year period becomes a problem. See how much time that gives people to identify as being black for 10 years, when in fact they're not. The money, the amount is really problematic because it's not even a drop in the bucket to what is owed just for slavery. That has nothing to do with Jim Crow and redlining and all the rest of that stuff. Now that's because the figure would really be in the trillions, in the teens of trillions, like 10 to 20 trillion. But I'll get to that in a minute. But the dollar amount is a concern. We might be able to up that. The bigger problem is the amount of time that it's going to take to be dispersed and how one qualifies for the disbursement. And that goes to that next bullet, that a council, and as you'll see on a subsequent screen, it's going to be a council of what she calls esteemed black leaders. And I'm pretty sure I know at least one person who's definitely going to be on that council, and that this one person is going to be extremely influential. And because I know what he has said, he being Dr. William Sandy Darity, economist out of Duke University, who's been working with Antonio Moore and Yvette on this thing for a couple, 3 years, and he's been doing work on reparations since long before Yvette had her Breaking Brown channel. I don't see how he's not going to be on the council, and I don't see how he's not going to be extremely influential. And he has, established that criteria that you document through genealogical research that you had an enslaved ancestor. So, that's consistent with that, and I think I've talked about the problems with that. Okay. But then she says the council will determine how to distribute the money, but then we have this next bullet, but the money must go towards economic and educational renewal. Now, what do you mean by the council will determine how to distribute it? You mean the mechanics of how to get the money out? Because at first I thought maybe you were saying the council will determine how the money would be spent. But no, you're going to tell us how it's going to be spent. You're not going to just give it to us. You're going to tell us how it has to be spent. And then this council of esteemed elders will determine how it's distributed. And I guess that goes to who qualifies. So we're back at that again. Goodness gracious. Okay, so now Marianne Williamson has since refined her proposal, and it is now on her website, right? So let's take a look at that. So you can see it says that she's a New York Times best-selling author, and we know that she's a presidential candidate right now. And so let's go ahead and look at what she has to say about reparations. She wrote A Course in Miracles or something like that. And you can see kind of, how she made her claim to fame. The Age of Miracles, blah, blah, blah. Look at all those books that she wrote. A Year of Miracles, Years to Triumph. She's supposed to be a spiritual luminary. But let's look at her verbiage on reparations. So she talks about race and repentance. That's not surprising given, that she leans towards, these spiritual things. She talks about deep truth telling. That's how she opened up her comments about reparations, that we need to pay it, that it's a debt owed, not assistance given. And she talks about how bad slavery was, how long it was, but not only that, she talks about the damage that was done after slavery. She talks about Martin Luther King, all of that stuff, benign neglect, all sounds really, really good. She talks about mass incarceration, so it seems like she's really up on things. But now let's get to the details of the reparations. So after she said all that, she talks about how much money is spent on the defense budget and how nobody ever asks how you're going to pay for that. So nobody should be asking how we're going to pay for the paltry sum of, and here we go, 200 billion. So she says right here, so it should not be considered unreasonable to suggest that America put 200 billion towards a reparations plan for African Americans, an educational, economic, and cultural fund. So now she's added cultural. She's not defined what she means by either educational, economic, and cultural. They become catch-alls when you don't define them. To be dispersed over a 10-year period. So now we're down from 20 years to 10 years, but that's still more than enough time, because again, it's going to take some time to wind itself through Congress. That gives you 10 years to start. You could be at the very end of that queue. In year 10, you've been identifying as Black for somewhere between 10 and 13 years. It's the Council of Esteemed African Americans, I guess that means ADOS, leaders. Okay, now the question is, how are they going to be chosen? Who's choosing them? Who's choosing them? And what method are they using to choose them? But no matter what method is being used to choose them, it's hard to see how, again, I'm probably repeating myself, it's hard to see how William Sandy Darity's not going to be influential on that panel, and how he's not going to be on that panel, and how because this is what he submitted to Congress, right? How his plan is not going to be the one that prevails. You know, his plan for how you qualify as ADOS. So let's go to his testimony. I showed this in a previous video, but yeah, Dr. William Sandy Darity, Dr. William Darity Jr., Samuel Du Bois Cook Professor of Public Policy, African and African American Studies and Economics, and Director of the Samuel Du Bois, I think it's Du Bois, Cook Center on Social Equity, Duke University. So this is what he submitted to the hearing on June 19th, 2019. And so, this has been shown before, but I want to refamiliarize people with what he is saying about how you qualify for reparations. So it's two-pronged. The first prong, or the first criteria, right here where my cursor is it will require genealogical documentation. So now we're going back to that missing page in a book. But I'm going to show you how it is a missing page in the book. Doesn't matter how conscientious you are. The odds are you're not going to, if you're truly ADOS, you're not going to find that page in that book. But that's a requirement. That's a requirement. And then he says no phenotype. Well, once you say that all you have to do is document through genealogy that you had an enslaved ancestor, you can say no phenotype. But see, now you're in a catch-22. Now we've been placed in a catch-22. Because most of us are not going to be able to find that document. We're not going to be able to find that document. And if we can't find the document, then the only thing we've got left is phenotype. I understand why you don't want to use ideology. I get that. A lot of people think the DNA test is going to be similar to phenotype. They're different. But I wouldn't go with DNA tests because I don't think that they're reliable for individual ancestry from everything I've read. But the point is that once you take away our biological proof, that we are the living proof, we are the living biological proof of our ancestry. Once you take away our phenotype, what have we got left? Because the very, very vast majority of us are not going to be able to provide a document of our ancestry. All we can do is just say, how do you think we got here? Look at me. Look at me. How do you think we got here? And then if somebody says, well, you could have immigrated here. And then we say, well, prove it. Because if my family immigrated here, there will be records in the archived documents of all the agencies that have been overseeing immigration for the last 150 years. I'm a black person here. Some of us, some black people over here did immigrate, and there are records that show that. But I did not, I submit to you. And if you say I'm lying, you produce the document that shows I emigrated. They won't be able to do it. But see, once you take away phenotype, we're left with nothing because we won't be able to document it. You see how that works? It's very vicious. Yeah, this paragraph down here, I'm cool. I am cool if what you're saying is you want to pay out reparations just for people whose ancestors endured slavery here in the United States of America. Of course, you don't want immigrants to get any of that. I'm okay with that. But I'm saying that the way you need to do it is just to take our phenotype as proof and then make sure that there's no record of our families having gravitated here, because that's the only way it's going to work for like some huge majority of us. We're not going to be able to come up with a document. And let me prove that. Or I shouldn't say prove it, underscore it. So this is a BBC document that I recently printed out, but I've had it for a while. You can see it's an old document. Not too old. It goes back to 2016. How do you trace your ancestors? And just want to go down to the part that I highlighted. Okay. So in this article, it reads as follows. African Americans were only recorded by first name and surname in the first census after the abolition of slavery in 1865. Before that time, slaves were not properly identified in records, says Megan Siekman, a senior researcher for New England Historic Genealogical Society. Most people hit a brick wall around 1870 and don't know where to go from there, she says. People are usually means more than 50%, usually limited to identifying slaves by slave owners' accounting records and inventories. Like 90-something%, unless you happen to be like in a special case like your ancestors were enslaved by the Jesuits in Maryland. But I'll continue. It's a common assumption that African American families carry the slaveholder's name. But in fact, slaves were given names or chose them for a wide variety of reasons, she says. And just like today, people change their names to Muslim names, to African names, our ancestors were choosing their names back then for various reasons. And, I just wonder, because they didn't generally have surnames during slavery. So once the 13th Amendment was passed and, they were told that they were free to, quote unquote, free to go. And this is just an aside. I have a hard time believing that after you've been whipped and worked to death and you're celebrating the fact that you're no longer a slave, I have a hard time believing that you would just pridefully take on the last name of your last owner or any of your owners. I don't know. That just, for whatever reason, there are a lot of black people named Washington and Jefferson and that type of thing. I don't know why they chose that name. Maybe they thought it made them feel distinguished. Or maybe they had that name because it identified them as somebody who worked on a big plantation and therefore, had certain skill sets. I don't know. But it may have been something other than that's the last. I mean, I don't see it as logical. But most didn't have any last names at all. So, again, I just question people taking it on because they were proud of it. And the other part is that even if they take that on initially, it's just you trying on some clothes. You can change your name again. We've changed our names for many reasons. I've changed my name in my lifetime like 4 times. And if you've just become emancipated, what's probably going to happen in 30, 40 years. Your name's going to go back and forth a few times. But I'll go on. When the slave owner is finally identified, deeds, wills, and bills of sale may provide only basic information such as a slave's age, gender, and skin tone. Hopefully I haven't said that already. Because of the scant amount of information, researchers are often forced to make logical deductions. A deduction is not a document. It's like circumstantial evidence. Now, in a courtroom, circumstantial evidence is usually not enough to convict someone. In a civil court, you say, well, it's the preponderance of evidence, right? But if you think that a deduction is not going to be challenged or rebuffed, I kind of don't know what to tell you. Don't know what to tell you. Because it is. But a deduction is not a documentation. A deduction is not a documentation. Okay, so it's logical deductions about family connections, says Sharon Morgan, founder of Our Black Ancestry, an organization that provides advice and material for African American genealogical research. It's really hard because your ancestors were listed as property in these deeds, and you can really only guess. A guess is not documentation. If you think they're going to be accepting guesses, you have another thing coming. Whose guesses? Whose guesses are going to be accepted? But what is the uniform standard? Guesses? I don't think so. I don't think so. It's a setup. It's a very, very diabolical setup. Okay. In the next one, I don't know why that's there. Let's look at the amount. That's the lesser of my concerns, but so I won't talk about that very long. But the calculation for what is owed just to match 40 acres and a mule, as you progress what that means in terms of present day dollars, is in the trillions, at least 14 trillion. And that's just for 40 acres and a mule. Now, 40 acres and a mule, of course, does not pay for all of the unpaid wages. You'd have to go to Dr. Darity's calculations for that. But it doesn't come close to the unpaid wages for slavery. It's just to match 40 acres and a mule. And that's in the trillions, the tens of the trillions. So when you're talking about billions, it doesn't even come close to what is owed to us. Not even for 40 acres and a mule. And then that, of course, doesn't even come close to what we're owed, which I've heard Dr. Darity say and other people say, nets far more than just slavery. All the stuff that happened to us after that. Right? Jim Crow. Redlining. All of that stuff. That has a bill that's even higher than slavery. But just for 40 acres and a mule, which isn't slavery, it's in the trillions. So let me do the math for you. If we go to the high end of what Marianne Williamson's proposal is for right now, 200 billion, that's 70 times less than 40 acres and a mule. But she says that that's what she believes to be politically feasible right now. So even the amount is a problem. But it's not the problem that the qualification of genealogical documentation is, when you can't use phenotype. What else we got? So I want to end this by referencing someone that I usually reference, and that is Mr. Neely Fuller Jr., the author of the United Independent Compensatory Code System Concept, a textbook workbook for thought, speech, and action for victims of racism, white supremacy. Now, I no longer use the term white supremacy to equate with racism. I use the term anti-blackness. So I'll be switching that out as I show you some things in this particular graphic from his book. This is a very old and worn copy of the book. I've had this book for a little over 20 years. I don't know where my newer copy is, but as you can see, it's well worn and well used. And here we are in the definition, tongue-tied a little more than usual today. We're in the definitionary part of his book at the back. Definitionary is sort of like a dictionary, but the point is to define all your terms. Because, earlier in this video, I was talking about defining what economic means. What does she mean by economic? What does she mean by cultural? What does she mean by educational? All these things are important because you've got to nail people down on where the money is going. The definitions are almost everything. You've probably heard me say that in previous videos. But we're in the L section of his definitionary. Why? Because we want to go to liberal. Is Miss Williamson practicing racism, liberal style? Or has she been persuaded to do it? We're supposed to be suspicious. Maybe she's not, but it is not intelligent, after all, the whole history of what we've been going through, to not be suspicious. That is something else that Mr. Fuller says. We should always be suspicious, no matter how good it sounds. So here is the definition of liberal at the back of his book in terms of, in racial terms. Liberal, racial, equals. Let's look at both of them. They're on page 273 of the old book. A white person, I just say a non-black person, who speaks and or acts to maintain white supremacy, I would say anti-blackness, racism, by using a greatly refined form of deceit. Now, I don't know if she's deliberately being deceitful. That would mean, to be deceitful, it has to be deliberate. But perhaps she is being influenced by people who are doing it deliberately. The deceit that is used by such persons is so refined that it is usually very acceptable, comfortable, and satisfying to the victims. And he says, non-white people, I say black people. Second definition, any white person who seeks to maintain white supremacy, I say anti-blackness, through the use of deceit, greatly defined. We'll go on. He has an explanation which gives examples of how they practice the liberal version of racism, examples of it. But I'm just going to go down to what I think is the most applicable part. Probably 4 works here too, because I don't know. I think she's probably working closely with people like Dr. Darity and Yvette and Antonio, but I'm going to focus on 5. Making suggestions to non-white people, and I'm going to say black people, that are attractive but are functionally designed to indirectly make non-white people, I say black people, to render better service to white supremacy, I say anti-blackness. So you got all the smarts. I mean, Dr. Darity is a genius. He's a genius. And this is not to say that I haven't made mistakes, because yes, I've made mistakes. I used to use the term white supremacy for decades. I used the term white supremacy instead of anti-blackness. And I assumed that our job was to convince the people with the greatest ability, which was white people, to produce the will to produce justice. But now I know, we probably ought to work on the ability side of black people, because of just the history. It just doesn't make any sense not to put more effort into increasing our ability to eradicate the system of anti-blackness, not to change the will of the people who are practicing it, right? And I highly suspect that people have been in true ADOS people's ear about the criteria of genealogical research. To be able to genealogically document it. I highly suspect that. I highly suspect they don't want us to use phenotype. That's how they're telling us apart every day, but that's the one they don't want us to use. So I highly suspect that somebody has been in Dr. Darity's ear, either directly or indirectly, who is a practitioner of the system of racism. I highly suspect that either Marianne Williamson is part of that group of people who's been in Dr. Darity's ear and people like him, and Antonio's ear and people like him, or that people who are not as well-meaning as Ms. Williamson have been in her ear. But I can't see how anybody who's intelligent and well-meaning and sane, because, we can get sane and insane to different degrees as being victims of anti-Blackness, could think that it's okay to require true ADOS people to produce documentation. I just can't see it. Why would you do that? Can't see it. We're not going to be able to find it. That's got to be taken out. So, yeah, I had said that when she made her announcement during the July 30th debate that she took the lead for my vote, but just by, a couple hairs. She doesn't get my full-throated support. And the reason is she's offering something, even if it's a couple pennies. So one of the things that's also in Mr. Fuller's book, which I've spoken about before, is that you ask for what is needed. Obviously, what is needed is way more than $200 million, way more than $14 trillion. But you ask for what is needed, and you accept what is granted, whether that's nothing or something. And then you look at it, you see how close it is to what you need. And if it's not what you need, you have to figure out a way to compensate for the difference. But what you don't do is you don't turn down what they agree to give you, even if it's something that that is owed to you. What you don't do is turn it down because it isn't exactly what you asked for. You don't turn it down just because it's far less. Example, you need, $10 for some Band-Aids or something, because somebody's caused you, punctured your hand, and you need a Band-Aid. Poor examples, but just stay with me here. But they offer you $2. Now, what you don't do is say that it's going to take $10. I asked you for $10. I'm not going to take anything until you give me what I want. I mean, you don't settle. You don't do like a settlement, like I agree to take $2 and never to again ask for anything more. But that's not what we're talking about here, right? I hope it's not what we're talking about here. I hope we acknowledge it's not enough money, but we take what they're willing to give us, because 2 is closer to 10 than 0. You're silly not to take the 2 just because it's not the 10 that you need. Take the 2 and then you're on your way, hopefully, to getting the other $8. So yeah, she's the first person who offered to pay and not just study paying. Yeah, okay. You're in the lead now. It's a pretty paltry thing that you're offering, but that's how bad everything is. That's how far off all the other candidates are. That's how far off all of the other politicians and statesmen and presidents and so on have been before this. But yeah, if you're willing to give $200 billion, and even through this shaky method through a council of esteemed leaders, and even through this shaky method of how they get appointed, I'll take it. But I mean, I'm one in the number who will end up with nothing if we can't convince them to drop that genealogical requirement. Now, if you've got genealogical records, great. I'm not saying it shouldn't be accepted, but it's going to be a small segment of us. That's great. But what about the rest of us? What about the rest of us? Okay, so the plan is to be back here tomorrow, August 10th, 4-ish here on the West Coast, 7-ish on the East Coast, to talk about Bro Kofi's thesis, with which I agree, that there are only 2 races of people on this planet, black and non-black, and the plan is for it to be a call-in program. The call-in number, which I'll just say it right now because I just don't feel like I'm going to get it. It's 760-249-2068, but I will have that listed in the thumbnail and program description. So You can call in if you want to talk about that. And we try to do things civil. Try not to talk over each other. Try not to call anybody any names, that type of thing. So that's the plan, to do that tomorrow. Again, that is the plan. But for now, this has been the Counter-Racist Evolving Engineer program for August 9th, 2019. Signing out.